Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story is about a girl named Lizaveta Finrats. She was born into the family of the Margrave of Finrats, and when she married of convenience, she was sent to the royal palace and became Elizabeth Alberg. In fact, many ladies of aristocratic society were very surprised when they heard that she was marrying a member of the royal family. After all, this particular girl was the 10th concubine, and they did not understand how such a choice could be made. Many ladies thought that it was very good that they were the ones not marrying His Highness the Prince, for otherwise things would have been very bad. People were talking about His Highness Leon Hart having a favorite. However, looking at it all from the perspective of the Finrats family, they thought it was quite a win-win to marry a daughter into the royal family. Of course, many have come up with the idea that this marriage was originally arranged because they wanted to take possession of the mines of the Finrats family. And yet the Princess of Crystals made herself known in that situation. All the residents were well aware of the rumors that the marriage was arranged for the benefit of the royal family through the production in the mines. Elizabeth herself was well aware of this. But she thought that once she married, the profits on their lands should also increase. It was not a marriage of love at all, yet she had to make the best of it somehow. That was the way she thought even on her own wedding day. Of course, after the wedding, there was to be a wedding night. However, she did not immediately understand what it was like to have a real marriage without love. Mr. Leon Hart, who became her husband, was that evening at the home of his concubine, whom he loved very much. To him, poor Elizabeth was no beloved princess. She was no more than an addition to the mines. Thus, the girl spent her days in the royal palace without crossing paths with Prince Leon Hart, who became her husband. In fact, in those days, mail was delivered with the help of special birds, and in this way, it was passed from one place to another. There was also a special post office on the estate, where a man sat to deal with it all. He would take the letters and then send the right ones. One morning a maid came in to see him and said that she had come to fetch letters for Mrs. Elizabeth. The man immediately handed her several envelopes and told her that a new letter had just arrived. 3 letters for Mrs. Elizabeth had arrived just this morning. The maid thanked him at once and said she would tell her mistress. She went to give the girl the letters. But as the maid passed by her colleagues, she overheard their conversation. One of the maids said, laughing, that it must be another letter for Elizabeth. The maid also said that even though she was a concubine, she had locked herself in her room and all she did was exchange letters with someone. It was very unusual for the maids to see such behavior, but they were well aware that Elizabeth was the 10th concubine who had not received His Majesty's attention. When the maid heard this, she did not react in any way to such words, for she was already accustomed to all the maids always talking about the mistress in this way. So she just went to Mistress Elizabeth's room. The maid's name was Elsa. As soon as she approached, she immediately knocked and called her name so that the girl would know who could be let in. At this moment, Elizabeth was sitting on her bed, and as soon as she heard that Elsa had come to see her, she immediately said with a smile that she could come in. When the maid came closer to her, the girl wondered in surprise. Had she received a new letter again? The maid said it was quite correct. Letters from Mr. Lucard, Mrs. Viola, and Mr. Liam had arrived that day. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She immediately picked up the very beautiful black envelope, thanked Elsa, and apologized again for bothering her. Elizabeth was the one her husband doesn't visit because he has another favorite. The girl was the 10th concubine who had no responsibilities. And one day, when she was spending her time in the library, she met one of the crown princesses, whose name was Sophiana. Finding herself in the same circumstances as Sophiana, who was so far removed from Prince Leon Hart, she found the truest kindred spirit. This girl also introduced her to her acquaintances from other countries, and thus Elizabeth began an exchange of letters to at least communicate with the world. And her first conversation partner and pen pal was Liam Sandharl. This Liam was the 3rd prince in the kingdom of Sensal, and she had received a very beautiful letter just from him. And of course, it was the first one she opened. As soon as she read his letter, she immediately saw that the man had sent her a recipe for air bread. In fact, she had no idea it was so easy. As expected from a large state, they just have a fancy kitchen, so she had no doubt that his recipes would be the best. After reading his letter, Elizabeth couldn't wait to write back. She also thought about sending this bread recipe to her father, for he would surely be pleased with it. After the girl had finished looking at the letter from all sides, she turned to Elsa and asked if she could prepare a paper for her. The maid, smiling, immediately went and brought all the necessary things: an envelope, paper, quill and ink, so that the lady could write a letter back. Elizabeth immediately thanked her and also asked her what she thought Liam's kingdom was really like. In fact, in the letters he sent, he wrote about trends in other countries and things like that, and that was all the girl knew. Elizabeth, thinking about it, immediately began to write a letter. She wrote about something she probably shouldn't say. But in the cruel palace in which she lives, these letters are her only hope for a better life. She also thanked him heartily for the recipe, but it wasn't long before even those happy days were shattered. Poor and unhappy Elizabeth was put away in a dungeon, very dark and distant, and her own husband called her a traitor. Elizabeth didn't understand what was even going on, and also why she was locked up, for it was not her fault at all. However, her husband was of a different opinion. He started shouting at her and told her to keep quiet and not to talk without his permission. He then turned to his knight Stanley, and the latter placed one very interesting thing in his hands. That item turned out to be a black envelope from Liam. Leon Hart looked her straight in the eye and said he couldn't believe his concubine had contacted other kingdoms. The girl immediately started screaming and said she wasn't contacting anyone. She was just socializing and nothing like that had happened. However, the man of course did not want to listen to her and asked, did she really want to take over the kingdom of Alberg through this? He had actually thought that she would do so. He did not expect to see her again. Of course it was a lie. She hadn't written a single word to the other kingdoms that could destroy her country where she resided. At this point, the man turned around and started to walk away, saying that he didn't need her false excuses and promises. He no longer believed a word she said. The girl kept screaming. She begged the Lord to listen to her and said she was not guilty of anything. However, in the end, her plea of innocence never reached Prince Leon Hart. Thus time passed, and she still continued to live in that dreadful dungeon where she could not communicate with anyone. Thus passed a whole month. For lunch, she had terrible stale bread and very dirty water. The girl was so exhausted that she could not even bring herself to eat. She couldn't understand why it had happened the way it did, because she really hadn't done anything wrong. Elizabeth merely enjoyed the humble companionship of others and did not know. Was it not allowed? The girl was already losing her last hopes for her better life and didn't understand why everything happened this way. She looked at the seal that had come from Liam and remembered the last conversation she'd had with her maid. Of course, the girl would like to know more about his country, where the one who wrote her letters was located. Elizabeth would very much like him to tell her everything. The girl would be interested in every little detail about his life. Suddenly, her eyes began to darken, and she thought that perhaps she could have lived her life differently. Soon, she completely closed her eyes and lost consciousness. In fact, there were so many things she would have liked to know about, for her life had been the ultimate chaos. She never returned to Finran's, and she wondered if any of her family grieved her death. Of course, Elizabeth would like to taste the food from her native place once more. And so after some time, the girl finally died and suddenly began to open her eyes in a completely different place. She was in a bright sunny room with lots of toys around her and birds singing outside the window as she started a new day. When Elizabeth touched her eyes, she couldn't understand why she was crying at all, because she was already old enough to restrain her emotions. But then, suddenly she turned her attention to her hands and realized that they were much smaller than usual. This surprised her very much. Elizabeth got up from her bed and thought about how this place looked a lot like her childhood room, and it was all rather strange. But soon she reached the mirror, and when she looked at her reflection, she saw there a little defenseless, crying girl. Elizabeth couldn't believe that this was really happening, so her legs couldn't even hold her up, and she fell to her knees. She stared silently at her reflection for a while, and then suddenly realized that she had somehow returned to the past. At the time she returned, she was no longer Prince Leonhardt's concubine. Elizabeth considered her appearance for a while longer, and then she suddenly realized that if she really had become a child, she needed to see what was up with her father and everyone else. She doesn't have time to change. She had to go and check everything urgently, so she runs out into the hallway in her pajamas herself. As soon as she ran to the door, she suddenly heard a very familiar voice saying good morning to someone. Elizabeth could not believe that she had heard him again. Then she allowed the room to be entered, and the door opened ajar. After that, a maid entered the room with her head down. She turned to Mistress Lisa and apologized for her delay. The maid also said that Madame had ordered her to take care of the ironing of the laundry, so she had to do a little of her bidding. But Elizabeth wasn't listening to her anymore. As soon as she saw her first maid, Lana, in front of her, she immediately ran to her in a hug. The girl was incredibly happy to see her first maid, so she started to cry even more. Lana was a little surprised when she felt the girl's strong embrace, but she soon embraced her in return and immediately inquired of Mistress Elizabeth what was the matter. Did she have a terrible dream? Elizabeth, continuing to cry, said that it was a very frightening dream indeed, and she could not believe that she could have dreamed it at all. In fact, in the past, when the issue of a marriage of convenience due to the mines was brought up, Lana immediately began protesting. She didn't understand how Elizabeth could be the 10th concubine, and when it was already time for the girl to marry, only Lana objected until the very end. The personal maid, who was 4 years older than the mistress herself, was incredibly dear to the girl. So now that Elizabeth saw her face again, she realized that she was even a little relieved, because Lana had been the first person to take her side. So, smiling, the girl told the maid that beside her she forgot all troubles and she felt good at heart. After that they embraced again. And after a while the maid said that the next time they had a terrible dream, she would be the first to run to her to comfort her. Elizabeth, immediately laughing, said that she was 1,000 times better than anyone else, and the maid also added that the girl could always rely on her, and she would never leave her in a difficult moment. The maid then wanted to help the girl change her clothes, but Elizabeth interrupted her and immediately asked her to remind her what day it was. She also asked if she could have breakfast with her father. Lana immediately smiled and said it was the first day of the water month and wondered if she had forgotten about it. But without waiting for an answer, she added that they had already recently celebrated her 7th birthday. So even her brothers had already come then, and it had been a grand celebration. When Elizabeth heard about it, she was very surprised, and Lana explained that the Lord had gone to the nearest town, and the brothers were on the front lines as always. She also said that she had heard that they wouldn't be back for a while yet. Elizabeth, hearing about it, immediately remembered and said that Lana was indeed right. In fact, Finran's territory bordered the Forest of Eternal Darkness, where the real monsters were born. The first generation of Franz was rewarded and became Margraves for their services in destroying the dragons that were attacking the state. So they were given the territory they needed to fight the monsters themselves. The Margrave's main duty was to prevent monsters from the Forest of Eternal Darkness from entering the royal capital. Of course, Elizabeth knew firsthand how dangerous these monsters were. She was well aware that her brother's work was incredibly hard. There were even times when they could not be contained on the front lines, and these monsters burst into the city, wreaking havoc. Each time, the dwellings and other structures collapsed, hindering the development of all the people in the place that was damaged by the monsters, very far away from the capital. There is no entertainment there, which is why the mines were Finran's main strength. There are monsters in the mines, so it's not easy either. However, you can find rare ores that make excellent weapons for fighting against these beasts. Soon Lana helped Elizabeth to dress fully and tidied her hair. She asked the maid where everyone else was. The maid said that Madame and Mrs. Rachel were to go shopping after breakfast. Elizabeth, When she heard about it, she was immediately reminded of the existence of that horrible stepmother Louise. This woman was evil incarnate, and she was the one who insisted on the engagement to the crown prince, and also said that it was great news for their entire family. To all the other unpleasant rumors about Prince Leonhardt was added the fact that he had a 10th concubine. Therefore, absolutely all the aristocratic daughters did not want to have any dealings with Elizabeth, and so she was completely friendless. This stepmother gave Elizabeth away in marriage without proper preparation, all just to kick her out of the house as soon as possible. Moreover, when the girl got married, her stepmother spread various terrible rumors about her and did not want to have any relationship at all. Elizabeth never understood why on earth she had to put up with the nasty things that were said to her all the time. However, there were some contentedly positive things about the royal palace that comforted her. Much time passed and Elizabeth became friends with Sophiana and made other pen pals. Such days were far more pleasant than those that depended on Mr. Leonhardt's disposition of mind. And soon the girl simply died, having never lived to see the happy ending she dreamed of so much. Shortly afterward, Lana finally did finish the girl's hair and said it was done. Elizabeth, seeing herself in the reflection, was immediately pleased and thanked the maid for her help. Then the girl finally realized that she had indeed returned to the past, which means that, apparently, the Lord has indeed given her another chance. So on this day, absolutely everything can change, and the story will get a new ending. The most recent information Elizabeth has learned from past life correspondences is what will happen in the future. Suddenly, the girl turned to Lana and, smiling, said that she could do anything. The maid was a little surprised and immediately asked what she was talking about. And the girl said with full confidence that she will find happiness in this life and things will definitely change. She needs to avoid engagement to be happy, and to do that she needs to develop their own lands. And then she would have plenty of time and various tasks to do. A maid came to Elizabeth, interrupting her musings. Lana smiled and said that now that she had changed her clothes, she could go to the dining room for breakfast, since she hadn't had time to eat yet herself due to some very urgent business. In fact, if you think about it that way, Lana is Elizabeth's personal maid, but then suddenly her mistress gives her some more tasks from above. At this point, there was an awkward silence between them, and they just stared at each other. Elizabeth held her hands out in front of her and giggled. The girl then took her maid by the hands and said that she apologized for what had happened and suggested that she go to breakfast as soon as possible, for she was anxious to eat. She also asked that Lana finish serving that day and get to breakfast as soon as possible. The maid was immediately pleased and thanked her for that. In fact, the family of the Margrave of Finrans was quite influential in society, precisely because of the obtaining of special minerals. The head of this family was Elizabeth's father. His name was Lyd, and there was an older son, Kite, and a middle son, Alt, and the father's second wife, Louisa. Also present in their family was Elizabeth's half-sister, Rachel. The poor girl's mother died when Elizabeth was only 3 years old, and she was left all alone. Then it was a huge blow to their whole family. Everyone was upset, both father and brothers. They did not know how they would live on without their beloved mother. Actually, being Margrave sounds pretty cool and prestigious no matter what anyone says. The royal family includes dukes, margraves, marquises, and counts themselves. Also viscounts and barons. Of all the titles, not counting royal nobility, they are of secondary importance. In reality, however, the impoverished margraves are no longer so important. Elizabeth's family used to have more freedom. Her grandfather, hailed as a hero who defeated the dragons that attacked the capital, was wounded. On top of being stripped of political status, the land's budget was cut and the soldiers who defended the country from the monsters were taken away. Then Elizabeth found out that it had all been arranged by the Minister of Finance. The reason is all because the girl the finance minister asked to be engaged chose Elizabeth's grandfather, and because of that, everything went wrong. They ended up right in the cage of this finance minister and could never get out of there again. Lyd, Elizabeth's father, loved only his wife and had no intention of marrying a second time at all. In the end, the people above took advantage of his soft character, but he had no choice but to marry a second time, since he was told to do so by an aristocrat who stood above him in status. That was the current Finran's family. Soon after, Elizabeth finally made her way downstairs to the dining room, where her stepmother and stepsister were already seated. As soon as the girl stepped inside, she immediately wished them good morning. The women broke away from their meal and looked at her in surprise. Louise spoke first. She looked at her stepdaughter and said that Elizabeth was a little late. She must have overslept again. Rachel, smiling happily, said that her little sister was incredibly stupid and didn't even know basic norms. Of course, Elizabeth did not like this behavior, but at the time she could not do anything about it. After all, she was only a small child. In fact, Louise Finrans, after Lizzie Lott, Elizabeth's mother, came from the capital to visit her grief-stricken father. Lizzie's half-sister, Lotta's half-sister Rachel, had also arrived at the estate with her. And even then, under the influence of her stepmother Louise, she was as annoying as her mother. Elizabeth walked over and slowly sat down at the table. She understood perfectly well that the most important thing was to ignore them. Soon, Lana came to her and brought out another plate of food. The girl was immediately happy and thanked the maid for it. She looked straight at her and said again, "Thank you very much for the food." And after that, she began her meal. Louise was at this moment angrily watching her stepdaughter, for she annoyed her very much. Elizabeth glimpsed a glimpse of her stepmother and noticed her gaze on herself, but said nothing to that. Louise broke their silence and laughed, and said that even though she was used to it, the food in this place was meager compared to the capital. Rachel immediately followed her mother's lead and rolled her eyes, sighing heavily. She also said that she wanted to eat something tasty. She missed eating at home so much. Elizabeth only silently observed the food they were served, and it was actually quite haute cuisine. Certainly the difference was indeed evident, despite the fact that they tried to cook good food in their home. Perhaps the girl should be grateful to the prince that she could at least eat good food back then. And Elizabeth immediately began to think back to the delicacies she had been able to taste when she lived with her fake husband. However, she still prefers the very ordinary bread their cook bakes, so even a loaf of it makes the girl happy. She broke off a loaf and began to eat it. In fact, the last bread she had eaten was moldy and very stale. It was impossible to bite into. So if the food was bad for these two women, it was still better than what the girl had been given in the dungeon, so she was glad. The moment Elizabeth was about to take a bite of her handful, she suddenly remembered that Lana's stomach was rumbling too, and she must have been incredibly hungry. So the girl immediately turned to the maid and whispered her thanks for serving, and told her that she had already eaten. So now it was her turn. When the maid heard this, she immediately shone with joy. She was about to take her place when Elizabeth's stepmother suddenly came to them. She looked angrily at them and said it was past the time for the servants to eat, so Lana was late. When Elizabeth heard this, she immediately jumped up and asked what was she even saying. She glared angrily at her stepmother, not understanding how a woman could say such a thing. However, Louise gave the maid a vicious look at this moment, so that Lana even began to shake with fear. So she immediately turned away from Mistress and said that it was fine and she had already eaten, so there was no need to do anything like that. Elizabeth, when she heard this, immediately became indignant. She could not believe that the maid and the other workers worked so hard day in and day out, and it was very hard work, even without breaks. And that day Lana even skipped one meal, and she is now not allowed by her mistress to eat elementary in order to have any strength to work further. So the girl immediately took the other half of the bread she had broken off and gave it to the maid, telling her to take at least that. Suddenly, her stepmother turned to her and said in an angry voice that this was unacceptable treatment of the servants and she should put the bread back immediately. Louise, smiling, asked where she got that kind of upbringing from if she let herself act like that. The girl immediately looked at her sternly and called her stepmother in a rough voice in protest, and the woman, hearing this, became very indignant and told her to watch her tongue carefully. However, Elizabeth said that with all due respect, the girl she could so brazenly communicate with no longer existed from that moment on. And she also said that the maid who was assigned to her was ordered to do the s'mores during the time allotted for meals. And Elizabeth, looking straight at her stepmother, said she thought she was the one who had done it. Louise, hearing this, immediately thought about it. She could not believe that she had not misheard and that she had understood everything correctly. She was very surprised by her stepdaughter's behavior because the girl had always been obedient and never crossed anything. But now she was behaving in a completely different way. So for a while, all four of them just stayed silent and looked at each other because they didn't even know what to say. Louise thought that Elizabeth was a real impudent girl and was about to say something when the girl interrupted her. She turned to her stepmother with a smile and asked, "Has she already forgotten something in the meantime?" Louise then immediately started yelling at her and said that this was also part of her duties as a maid, so she saw absolutely no problem. Elizabeth continued to insist and said that she was talking about some ridiculous things. After all, Lana was her personal maid, and it was absurd to give her any work without her mistress's permission. When the maid heard this, she looked at the girl in surprise. She couldn't believe that Elizabeth had actually started to stand up for her. At this point, she made a very sad expression on her face and continued to address her stepmother, saying that even so, she absolutely didn't care how her stepdaughter was doing at all, and wondered, does her stepmother hate her so much that she's even willing to do something like this? Lana immediately turned to her little mistress and began to comfort her, for the girl was really crying. Louise began to shout even louder and said that she was the wife of the master of the house and the servants had to listen to her. Rachel at this moment also began to agree with her dear mother and agreed with everything. However, Elizabeth wiped away her tears at this point, and with a smile she turned to her stepmother and said that the woman must have already forgotten something. Seeing her surprised look on her face, she said that her mother had Lana assigned to her when Elizabeth was still very young, and it didn't matter that the woman was now the legal wife of the head of the family. She still wouldn't do what the woman wanted without the little mistress's permission. Elizabeth also said that all she could do at all was when her mom was still with them. The main maid in the house was Lana's mom, which is how she ended up sticking it to her and then firing her. Elizabeth told her stepmother that she feared the same trouble she had then when she was still living in her house. At this point, Louise became so angry that a vein even showed on her forehead. She started yelling at her stepdaughter very loudly. The woman said that they should have guests very soon, so she would go and make sure the garden was perfect. Louise wasn't going to argue with her anymore. She took her daughter's hand and told her they were leaving. Rachel, before she walked out the door, showed her stepsister her tongue in protest. But Elizabeth had absolutely no reaction to it, because from now on, she was going to never let her stepmother and her daughter treat her like that again. Then suddenly Lana started crying loudly and turned to Mistress. She was really very upset and surprised, but Elizabeth hugged her and said that now she could at least eat in peace without the two girls. The maid thanked her at once and said that she would always be at her side and would try to be even more supportive. Immediately after breakfast, Elizabeth and her maid went to the garden that was in the backyard of the mansion. In fact, the girl came to water everything there. However, nothing has grown since she planted it. Suddenly, the girl had a very good idea. She decided to try the fertilizer that she had learned about from letters from her new friends, and she had never been able to try it in her previous life. In fact, Elizabeth learned about so many things from her pen pals, and fertilizer was just one of them. She leaned closer to the ground and began to tell Lana that to make fertilizer, you have to dig a hole, put fallen leaves and all the grass in it. Then a little water is needed to allow everything to rot. This is exactly what Elizabeth did to make her plants finally grow. However, at this moment, she also remembered that someone had written that it would take about half a year to make. So with a heavy sigh, she got to her feet and said that absolutely everything would take time. And so, when quite a bit of time had passed, and Elizabeth had fertilized absolutely every piece of her garden, she finally got up and finished. After that, she turned around and saw a maid who was nearby washing dishes after breakfast. And the girl was very surprised when she saw that the maid was all alone and she had quite a large number of plates. So Elizabeth approached her maid, taking the towel from her, and said that their family's financial difficulties were quite serious, since they couldn't afford another maid to do the dishes. In fact, she found it hard to believe that an entire mansion of the Earl's brand and very few servants. The landlord was completely worthless, and so her father is looked down upon in society and not seen as an aristocrat at all. Elizabeth immediately thought about it and remembered that in the previous life, the income had not increased at all, and the expenses had only increased, so he had to give leave to many servants. Thus, most of the laborers they had in the house simply went to other jobs, for the markographer could not provide for them. Suddenly, Elizabeth began to panic, for she realized that if things continued, they would have to reduce the number of servants even more. And then she said she would marry a man of royalty who was only interested in mining crystals, not herself. Elizabeth realized that if she did not develop the land in any way, things would end very badly. So she must find the right conditions for people to live in. In order to do so, it is very necessary for them to improve their territories and increase the family's authority. So it is she who, being 7 years old, is going to gradually strengthen the lands with the help of knowledge from her past life. Thanks to her pen pals, she was able to learn quite a bit, so there should be no problem with that. But Elizabeth had one very important question. Why did they have so few opportunities? They fight to defend the country from the monsters of the nearby forest, and she knows that it takes a fair amount of money to do so. Expenses for weapons and armor are quite large, and there will also be expenses for the treatment of soldiers, for the repair of destroyed buildings, and if you add it all up, it comes out to a very large amount. However, even if the amount has decreased since the loss of her grandfather's position, she is sure that some money should come from the state as a token of assistance. And at that moment, Elizabeth suddenly heard not far away from her some incomprehensible voice that came from the room. As soon as she got to the window, she immediately looked in there and saw her stepsister there, who was happily looking at one piece of jewelry and saying that this thing was incredibly cute. Rachel told her mother that she really wanted it, and the woman, after stroking her daughter's head, replied that it was a beautiful piece of jewelry and offered to buy it after all, because her daughter deserved everything. The man who was selling various items to the aristocrats smiled and told the girl that she had very good taste since her daughter had chosen this necklace. After that, he pulled out something else and said he thought a fine dress would also go with such a piece of jewelry. Louise, smiling, said that of course they would take him too, and Elizabeth, hearing all this, was incredibly surprised. And all because the kind of dress they've chosen would be suitable even for an evening at the royal palace. It's incredibly expensive and luxurious for a little girl like Rachel. She thought about the fact that if her stepmother and her sister kept buying whatever they wanted, they would have absolutely no money left that way. And Elizabeth made the decision that she had to deal with the matter urgently before it was all too late. From that moment, some more time passed, and Mrs. Louise bought some more things for herself, and the seller at this moment began to leave the estate already. The man was incredibly happy because the sales were very good and was about to go home because his norm was fulfilled, and there were very few goods left. Before he could leave, however, Elizabeth came up to him and said hello. The girl immediately curtsied, as was proper. The man stopped and looked at her in surprise, but also said hello. The salesman was a little flustered and wondered, was there really something she wanted to buy from him? For he didn't understand why she suddenly stopped him. Elizabeth thought at that moment that this was apparently the first time she could address him while the head of the family was not around. Before this happened, the seller also offered the lady a beautiful pendant that was made by polishing a crystal of the highest quality. After he showed it to Louise, he immediately asked her if she liked it. The girl was not very pleased with its condition, but said that it was not bad after all. The salesman got very upset at that point and decided to change the topic of conversation by asking how they were doing lately. The woman was incredibly angry. She started yelling and said that nothing good ever happens in the middle of nowhere. She lives like Groundhog Day. She also added that she had already managed to ruin her mood since the morning. It was Elizabeth who took to sassing her stepmother at breakfast. When the man heard this, he was very surprised. He could not believe that Elizabeth could actually dare to impertinence Louise. But now that the girl had come up to him as well, he was surprised and didn't understand what she had even come for. But after a short silence, Elizabeth, smiling happily, said that they had nothing going on in their city, and she would like to know at least what was going on in the capital. When the seller heard this, he was genuinely surprised and asked what exactly she wanted to know. The girl said that she was curious about what was popular among girls there and everything like that. He knew immediately what she was talking about. He was actually cautious after talking about Elizabeth's insolence. However, as expected, she was only a child, so he stopped being afraid of her quite quickly. So the man said that it was very fashionable among aristocrats to give poems. They often sent poems written on bookmarks or on postcards. To their girlfriends, they send them and the subject of who they have unrequited love for, or to their fiancés. There are poems that are written by a popular girl and sell even at a high price. Elizabeth, hearing this, immediately began to admire it. She knew it would be in vogue. To the last, she doubted that it would be the same as in the past. However, it did turn out to be true. So she started pulling something out of her purse and said that she had also started to get into writing poetry. Afterward, she handed him some papers with poems written on them, and also added that she was very glad to be doing what other girls in the capital were doing. It was very important to her. When the man saw what she had written, he was very delighted and surprised. He said she had amazingly beautiful handwriting. He was actually talking about poetry to Miss Rachel as well. And although the poems were not written by a professional, the difference is still tremendous. The seller had never seen such beautiful handwriting as Elizabeth's before, and couldn't believe that a small child had actually written it. But he decided that she must have fooled him and that these verses were written by someone from the adults, because a 7-year-old child, in his opinion, can't write each letter so beautifully. While the man was looking at these notes, Elizabeth leaned over and began to write something on the ground with a twig. When he noticed this, he immediately bent down behind her and wondered what it was she was playing at all. She looked up at him and said that it was indeed she herself who had written. For at that moment, with a stick on the ground, she repeated the same incredibly beautiful handwriting. The man was very surprised when he saw it and said with admiration that she was indeed an incredibly capable girl. Elizabeth explained that she really enjoys reading books and admires beautiful handwriting, so she practices every time she has the time and desire to do so. She then placed the shelf beside her and, holding her palms out in front of her, asked if he wanted to buy the bookmarks from her. In the end, the man, after some thought, still agreed and gave, barely willed, 1 coin for all the bookmarks she had handed him. Soon the girl returned to her room. Lana was already there, and she asked in surprise where she got the money from in the first place, and also what it was for. Lisa replied that it had become very popular to give poems in the royal capital, and she had only recently learned about it. The girl also said that someone bought a bookmark with a poem she had written, because her handwriting was so beautiful, and that's where she got the money from. When Lana heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Is she really so good at this that she was even paid money?" Elizabeth had a special savings box. She was going to buy things in the future that they didn't have enough money for before, and to do that, they needed to start doing something and put some aside. The maid cheerfully said that she wanted to help her too, so she would write with her. Elizabeth then asked if Lana could accompany her into town for them to look at some more things. Of course, the maid agreed, and soon they arrived in the city, where there were a lot of people. People in the market selling their products and all the time shouting something, calling customers to them, and others just strolling around. As soon as the girl saw all this, she immediately said that she was very nostalgic, so she was very happy to visit it again. In fact, she had been to the city a lot as a child. She didn't think much of it then, but now she realizes that she didn't want to spend time with her stepmother and Rachel, so she kept trying to run away from home at the first opportunity. However, this time, she wasn't going to let them do whatever they wanted to her, so Elizabeth was going to deal with the state of their land first. After that, she must get the people on her side in order to get their support, and things will definitely improve then. But as soon as she arrived in the city, she immediately began to keep a close eye on the situation, and the streets were filled with wounded soldiers and families below the poverty line. For her as a child, it was all very commonplace. Finranza lands in a tragic state, as it turns out. So Elizabeth realized that she had to fix this situation somehow in order for things to finally get back to normal. At this point, as they walked a little farther, she suddenly saw some guy walking straight ahead and looking at a piece of paper. Elizabeth also noticed that he could hardly move his legs and immediately assumed that he was adventurous. So the girl quickly ran up to him and asked him if he was looking for something. The man, who was immersed in his own thoughts, did not immediately understand what she was talking about, so he asked again. After she repeated her question, he replied that he had just lost his way and asked where the magic tower was. Elizabeth, smiling, said she would be just around another corner and wondered if he was an adventurer and had come to this city as a newcomer. The man immediately felt a little better after he recognized the right road and said that it was really true. He was that kind of person. Then she recommended him to stay at a house nearby. They have very good food and sometimes even give him bread as a snack. She then pointed to another house and said that in that cupboard there was a grandfather who loved to cook and had the most new dishes in the whole town. She also added that the meat there is incredibly soft and easy to eat, so she highly recommended that place to him. However, when she didn't see any reaction on the guy's face, she thought he was kind of suspicious and even a little strange. But at this moment, the adventurer laughed and thanked her for these tips. He also said that he had just arrived in their city, so she had been incredibly helpful to him. Elizabeth immediately felt a little better and said that there was nothing wrong with that. She was even very glad to be of use to him. And she herself at this point wondered if this encounter would be a glitch, but assumed that it was okay, and she had pointed out the really right way to the adventurer. But still, this man seemed incredibly familiar to her. She thought she might have seen him somewhere before, even in a past life. Then suddenly she heard a very loud baby cry, and after she had time to realize what was happening, she was already being hugged by a little girl. Some other children came up behind this little girl, and one of them, indignant, said that it was very dangerous to jump on a man so suddenly. As soon as Elizabeth looked around, she immediately realized that these were the children she had played with as a child in her past life. At this moment, tears began to come to her eyes, for she had not seen them for a long time indeed, and such a meeting was incredibly pleasant for her. But she was quickly able to master her emotions, and as she hugged her friends, she immediately inquired how they were doing in general. The girl was a little surprised and asked why she was acting like this, since they had only seen each other yesterday. Elizabeth immediately realized that she was giving herself away a little, but she didn't care. While the children paid no further attention and said they were going to gather medicinal herbs and asked if she wanted to go with them. Another little girl said they were going out to get herbs, for their mother was swearing that the supply would soon run out. Also, they thought they could still chase the rabbits if they were there. It was one of their favorite pastimes. Elizabeth, upon hearing this, immediately said that it was very cool, so she agreed to go along with them. Lana turned to her and said with a smile that she could go, but only if she could be back in time for dinner. Elizabeth immediately said that she would make it, and thanked the maid for her permission as well. And turning around, she said that in that case they would have a simply sumptuous dinner that day, if all went well. Some time has passed since then, and all the children have gone beyond the city limits of Finrands. There are only weak monsters in those neighborhoods, so it was okay for kids to enter that place. As the children were walking through the woods, one boy hit some green creature with a stick, and it immediately spread like jelly. He bent down to see who it was and immediately told the others that the animal was called a thrasher. The guy also explained that there is absolutely no need to be afraid of him, because no matter how many of them you meet, they are completely harmless. In fact, monsters that have a small size have a rather weak attack, so anyone can deal with them. At that moment, a girl and her friend suddenly approached them and told them to leave as soon as possible, because it would be getting dark very soon. Elizabeth, along with Lana, briefly followed them, while she thought about the fact that they needed to hunt rabbits. It is common to shoot rabbits with a bow, however, this is quite ineffective, and all because in a few years an improved way of hunting would be common. Then Elizabeth turned to Teru, her friend, and asked how many arrows they had. The boy immediately pointed to his equipment and replied that he had brought quite a lot this day, so he thought they could at least catch one rabbit. Then Elizabeth, smiling, said that there was something else she would like to try. Her friends were immediately surprised and wondered what she was talking about. Then she replied that they needed something like a thin rope to start with and immediately asked if they had it. Teru, on hearing this, was a little surprised, but at once he handed her a rope and said he always carried one with him, for anything might happen, and a rope would always come in handy. Elizabeth immediately took it to herself and said they could use it to make a trap. When everyone present heard this, they were very surprised. Even Lana hadn't expected to hear such a thing. But the girl explained that along with where the rabbits run through, you have to set a loop trap, and when the rabbit gets in the loop, they just tighten the rope. This method is much better in that if you pull harder, there is a much smaller chance that it may slip away. So she went to one tree, tied one end of the rope there, and from the other made a loop and put it near, saying that she should also put stones around the rope. Elizabeth explained that making the rabbit jump over the trap would increase the probability of success. After that, she also took out the fire flower stone and said that it was the most important attribute. In fact, the fire flower stone is a very important item, and Elizabeth almost always carries it with her when she goes out of town. This is the kind of thing that can be used both to start a fire and to throw at an attacking animal. So smiling, she told her friends that rabbits could thus be frightened a little and thus lured into their trap. Teru was very surprised and even pleased with the new method of catching and asked, "Is it really possible to catch a whole rabbit with this?" He doubted such methods. At this point, Lana was simply glowing with joy, and turning to the mistress, said that the girl was just great. She didn't think she was capable of coming up with such brilliant ideas. Elizabeth, smiling, said that certainly catching a rabbit in a trap required a rather large amount of time, so she suggested that they gather medicinal herbs for now. Some time passed since then. They went to another clearing and finally found the herbs they needed. They even made a competition among themselves. Who could find this herb faster? And so Elizabeth turned to her maid and said that they couldn't lose, so they had to try their best. The maid, who was only a few years older than these children, was immediately excited and accepted the challenge, so she started looking for flowers with them. In fact, medicinal herbs grow absolutely everywhere. You can use them just for fun, or you can make special medicines from them. There are 3 types of magic in their world. The first is, of course, healing magic, which is pretty important. Healing magic can be used to create healing medicine, and there are healing herbs that can also be used to heal wounds. Healing magic can only be used by those who have it in their blood, which is why most such people are aristocrats. Healing medicines are very expensive because they are made with the help of magic. And that's why ordinary people who don't have wealth make medicines from medicinal herbs on their own. And also, natural healing is common in the country, so people know on whatever grows in the forest nearby. At that moment in which Elizabeth was reborn, cultivating medicinal herbs was in no way possible. However, 10 years later, ways to grow them would be approved. And if you started growing these herbs for the public, and of course for the soldiers, life would become much easier and simpler. At this point, the little girl who had first found the herbs immediately turned to her friends and said that there were a lot of them there, so she suggested that they come over and pick some already. As soon as they ran up, they immediately saw a huge flower with medicinal herb and were very surprised. Teru immediately praised the girl, whose name was Rosa, and said she was very attentive and it was good for her. Lana also ran up to them and told them that with that many, they would have absolutely no problems with supplies. Oh, they picked some herbs, and after that they said they could take a little break, so they set all their arsenal aside and went to play. The children ran and jumped, The girls also wove a beautiful wreath of lovely yellow flowers for Elizabeth. Rose, who put it on the girl's head, immediately said that it suits her very well and she looks even cuter. Elizabeth laughed and immediately thanked, and her older friend said that thanks to her, they had collected a lot of medicinal herbs, so it was great that she had joined them. Tarot was not far from them at this point and picked up a stick from the floor and said that he didn't understand why the girls were enjoying all this. So, taking a swing, he said he would rather practice fencing more than weave some obscure wreaths that would soon wither altogether. Since he said he was going to be a future knight, so he needed to train as much as possible. But the boy was so much into it that he didn't even notice that a huge animal appeared behind him. Elizabeth was the first to notice it and immediately started yelling at him to be careful. Tarot immediately turned around and saw the wolf attacking him. He screamed loudly in fear but froze and couldn't even run away. At this point, the older girl immediately ran to the bow but had no way of knowing how to insert the arrow. She was still very scared for her best friend's health. At this point, the animal had already pounced on the boy and was about to bite his throat. Elizabeth decided to take matters into her own hands. She ran over to Meryl and asked her to hand her the bow as soon as possible. She talked in her head about how everything was going to be okay. If she used the bow, she could save her friend's life. No doubt she remembers a little, since she did it in a past life. It had been a long time since then, but she still had some knowledge. So Elizabeth drew her arrow and aimed at the wolf at a distance from the animal. So this animal did not have time to bite the throat of their friend, but immediately got hit in the ear. When it was frightened, it immediately ran back into the forest. Thus, when it was over, Meryl was the first to run up to the boy and ask if he was okay. Tarot was in an incredibly shocked state and simply said that he was fine. At that moment, Elizabeth exhaled in relief. She dropped to the ground and said that thank goodness everything worked. Lana immediately ran up to her and asked if she was okay. The girl replied that she was fine and thanked her for her concern. After catching her breath a bit, Elizabeth offered to go already and check out the trap and get home as soon as possible. Of course, no one objected. Closer to the time when the sun began to sink below the horizon, they returned to the clearing where they had left the special rabbit trap. And once they'd done it, they were very happy. They had set more than one trap and were able to catch a few rabbits. When Lana saw this, she immediately began to rejoice and told her mistress that they were able to catch these animals after all. She really couldn't believe that her mistress had come up with such an effective method. All of her friends also began to cheer and talked about how they might even roast them whole for dinner and finally get full. But Elizabeth wasn't really that excited along with her friends. She kept thinking about the situation that had happened a few hours ago. She knew this place wasn't supposed to have monsters and she couldn't believe they were facing such danger. So she needed to succeed in cultivating medicinal herbs as soon as possible using the knowledge from her past life, because otherwise things might not end well. At that moment, Lana turned to Mistress and seeing the look on her face immediately wondered what she was thinking about. Elizabeth stepped closer to her and said, smiling as she wondered what the bright future held for them. When the next morning came, the girl immediately began to consider what they had collected. Elizabeth gathered all the herbs they had managed to take and began to go through them. She thought about the fact that a beginning had been made. Actually, growing medicinal herbs can help in land development, so Elizabeth was very serious about it. But as soon as she picked up the first branch, she saw that the stem had broken, and she was very upset about it. The girl realized that in such a state it would be impossible to put it away, so she would have to use it somewhere else. In fact, you only need two things to cultivate medicinal herbs. It's a magic core and an earth containing magic power. And the magic cores are in the magic tower, so she decided to go there. The magic tower is actually an institution that is dedicated to both the study of magical tools and the suppression of monsters. And its branch is present in all regions that have a large number of monsters. Therefore, it was also present in their town. As soon as the day came, Elizabeth and her maid went to the tower, and Lana saw the unit and wondered if this was really it. The girl was very surprised, for she was there for the first time, and she had not seen such a scale of buildings for a long time. Elizabeth said that it was her first time here herself, so they were a little nervous. But they were brave enough to go through all the wizards who were near the tower. As soon as they got inside, they didn't know what to do. There was a man sitting at the reception desk not far from them. He was very upset and thought about the fact that he would have to be without money again that day. Then suddenly, Elizabeth came up to him, and standing up on her toes to reach his face, she apologized and said she had something to ask. The man, when he saw her, immediately slapped his finger on her forehead and told her that it was forbidden for children to be in that place, and advised her to go home as soon as possible. Otherwise, her mother would be very worried. When she heard this behavior, she was very surprised and did not understand what they were even allowing themselves. Elizabeth even wondered if they had accidentally gotten the wrong address. However, at that moment, a girl in uniform passed by them and upon seeing Elizabeth, immediately realized that things were bad. She ran up to her partner and turned to Mrs. Elizabeth and said that they offered their sincere apologies and also inquired what they could do to help a lovely lady like her. The guy who was slapped in the face by her partner looked at her in surprise and asked if this was the same Elizabeth who was the daughter of the owner of the estate. The girl, who was a sorceress and her name was Melissa, immediately chased her partner away, releasing a small snake with her magic. She told him in a rough voice that she could handle it herself, so he should leave. The guy still didn't understand what was going on, but he didn't stay there long and ran away. When Elizabeth heard all this, she thought of Melissa being incredibly harsh. In fact, this woman was the head of the Magic Tower department. Her face was very familiar to the girl, for sometimes she came to their house on business with her father. When she calmed down a little, Melissa turned to her mistress and apologized, asking if they had inconvenienced her. Elizabeth realized that that guy was definitely not going to be well, so she said that everything was fine and they could take it easy. Melissa then inquired as to the occasion for which she had come to see them, and also inquired as to whether it was correct that this was her first time in their ward. Elizabeth was glowing with joy and said that she would actually like to order magic cores from them on a regular basis and asked if they could help her with that. Melissa, immediately smiling, said that of course they could help her, and wondered if she had already decided on the very color of those nuclei. Without waiting for her answer, she said she would show her the samples and pulled out a small box that contained them. She explained that magic cores are pulled from monsters' hearts, and the color of the core is determined by how strong the monster is. The highest grade core is black and white, followed by red, blue, green, yellow, and ash magical cores. These were the colors she showed Elizabeth so she could pick out what she wanted. The girl immediately thought about the fact that she only needed the core to cultivate ordinary medicinal herbs, so she requested that she give her an ash-colored core, which was also the lowest rank. Melissa said with a smile that there was no problem with that, and also added that a single ash core would cost 100 derte. Elizabeth was satisfied with that price and asked to be given only 30 grand for the first time. Melissa said that of course she would give it to her no problem, and soon handed over just the right amount of these very stones in a bag. And Elizabeth said she wants to shop regularly in the future and asked if they would have them in stock so that they could buy without a problem. Melissa said with a smile on her face that they get ash kernels absolutely every day, so as long as she doesn't acquire a very large amount, she'll be fine. The girl took her purchase and said that in that case, she would come to procure some more soon, and the woman, after bidding her farewell, said that in that case they would look forward to seeing her. Elizabeth and her maid went outside then, and she thought of the next thing she would need was land. There were two ways for them to get the right land that was filled with magical power. Of course, the main way was to directly fill the earth with this magical power, or to collect it in a place where there was already a lot of magical energy. Certainly, if Elizabeth was very good with magic, she could make such a land herself, and there would be no problem. However, unfortunately for her, she was very bad with magic, and although she seems to have a disposition, however, Nothing was ever revealed as to what her ability was. And that's why she had only one option left, and that was to go and collect the land herself. After a little thought, Elizabeth suddenly remembered that she needed to hire a guard, and then she could definitely set off. Lana, when she heard this, was very surprised and asked, "Does Mistress really need the land that badly?" The girl at this point went over to the bulletin board and said she would tell her everything later and show her how she would use it. At this point, Melissa immediately approached them and asked if she needed anything else and said she was ready to counsel her. Elizabeth, very surprised to hear her, soon sat down at the table, and the woman said she could provide her with whatever she needed. Then the girl replied that she needed an escort to gather the land, and Melissa gave her a few options. She showed her a piece of paper that had the rates for the request for escorts and listed the prices accordingly. When the girl saw this, she was very surprised and realized that even the lowest attendant of her money from the sale of 2 bookmarks would not be enough at all. It was all very upsetting to Elizabeth, but somehow she knew that really escorting was not a cheap affair, so she couldn't expect a very good price. Then she thought that she could probably ask her father for money, but he wasn't home at the time, and her stepmother wouldn't let her borrow money. Then Elizabeth told Melissa in a trembling voice that it was a bit of a large sum and the money at her disposal was completely insufficient. Melissa replied that they have a lot of monsters in this place, that's why the escort fee is so high. At that moment, a guy came up behind them and asked what had happened. He recognized Elizaveta from behind because they had met. When the girl turned around, she saw a red-haired guy in front of her asking her if she really needed security. This was exactly the guy Elizabeth had given directions to, and smiling, he said that if she really needed help, he could escort her. He also said that he hadn't introduced himself yet, so he replied that his name was Leo, and also said that he was very pleased to meet her again. Elizabeth said her name and also said he could just abbreviate it. Also with a smile on his face, Leo said that she had oriented him in the city last afternoon, and in gratitude, he would like to escort her as well and help with the case. The guy said he could rely on her, and Elizabeth at this point was already really starting to doubt, remembering how poorly he navigated the terrain. Could he really be trusted? At that moment, another guy came up behind them. It was just the one who had originally serviced the girl. He made a very surprised face and wondered if Lady Elizabeth would really be accompanied by someone who had just come to the magic tower. When Elizabeth saw him, she sighed heavily, for it was that unpleasant man again. Melissa spoke up and asked Heather what he was saying. She also replied that Leo has a pretty solid track record as an adventurer, so he doesn't need to completely insult the guy. However, this heaver came up to the poor fellow and grabbed him by his clothes, telling him that a brat like him could only go as an escort if it was some small animal. In fact, the man was doing it on purpose. He was looking at Elizabeth and thinking about the fact that this was precisely his chance to raise his salary. The boy thought that all he had to do was report his actions to the Count, and then everything would be fine. He thought that the Earl was obliged to know about his abilities, so he tried to show his authority in front of Elizabeth. Leo at this point was incredibly surprised and didn't understand what was even going on, as well as why this guy was picking on him. However, Heather suddenly already wanted to hit him, but Leo managed to react first and hit him in the face so that the guy flew a few meters away and hit the ground.